Welcome, everyone, to our second day of the final conference and the final webinar of our Swirl project. Today is a sunny day in Milan. I hope it's the same in your cities. I don't know, yesterday it was raining, but today there is the sun. I think it's good for everyone. No, not in Germany, no, not everywhere. Okay, so I will bring the sun, the Milanese sun to the webinar and I will start. And this morning we start with a video about that summarize data about the trends in employment, in particular contingent work. And okay, we can see the video and the data provided in the video were analyzed by ACTA. So thanks ACTA, that's our partner in the project, and we share our data and information. So please, Sarah, let's start.
Thanks to the Swirl project, we had the opportunity to analyze the employment situation and main trends across the EU in the period between 2011 and 2019, that is, before the COVID crisis. First of all, we can observe a growth in overall employment. Employment growth has been driven by high-skilled work and is consistent with an increase in the level of education of the population. The importance of high qualifications is even more striking in self-employment. The decline in traditional, predominantly low-skill self-employment is offset by the strong growth in high-skilled independent professionals. There has been a stabilization of employment resulting from three trends. First, since 2013, there has been an increase in permanent employment. Second, the highest growth in temporary agency work was registered among those employed under permanent contracts. Third, the number of workers employed for 20 to 40 hours a week increased significantly. Looking at the sectors, we see that employment grew in all sectors with the exception of agriculture. Moreover, there has been a strong growth in services, especially professional activities, ICT, hotels, and restaurants. If we distinguish among different European areas, we can observe that Mediterranean countries have a more difficult employment situation. Labor forces are older and with low education. More often, they work as low qualification employees. We can imagine that these countries will experience the pandemic-related crisis even more strongly than the rest of Europe.
Okay, thanks. I leave the floor to Pamela and Vassil for the first panel about the institutional framework. So please, the floor is yours.
Okay. So you can all see me and everything because you're still, Ivana is still the person on my screen. So
I can see you.
Okay. Good. I just thank you, everyone, and thank you also especially to SMART for organizing this great conference. So we are going to begin with a video on institutional frameworks, which hopefully helps you understand what they mean. So, Sarah.
In the frame of the Swirl project, we've analyzed the links between slashers, contingent work, and platforms. We also looked into how these workers are addressed within different institutional frameworks. To illustrate some innovative approaches and let the field actors speak from their point of view, we've interviewed representatives of two organizations providing different yet complementary approaches. The Spanish initiative Tu Respuesta Sindical Ya of the UGT Union, and SMART, the cooperative of freelancers active in 8 EU countries. How do you support slash workers and/or platform workers?
SMART, c'est un outil qui correspond très bien à la diversité justement déjà à l'intérieur de Smart, il y a une diversité de profils. Donc, on peut ramener à l'intérieur de Smart l'ensemble des activités qu'on fait et un peu les unifier dans un parcours qui peut paraître éclaté. Je fais un jour tel métier, un jour tel autre métier. Un jour, c'est moi qui porte le projet et je travaille avec d'autres. Un jour, je suis au service d'autres personnes. Tout ça, à l'intérieur de Smart, est simplifié. J'émets des factures pour mes prestations. Pas Smart, j'émets des factures pour mes prestations. Et j'ai un contrat de travail. Que ce contrat de travail, je fasse un jour peintre, le lendemain de l'intervention mécanique. La base reste la même. Je suis salarié et j'accède aux mêmes outils, à la même sécurité. Une autre chose qui est très intéressante aussi, je pense, pour les slashers, c'est l'effet de communauté. C'est-à-dire que je pense que c'est quand on est comme ça en multi-activité, on travaille rarement seul. On est souvent connecté à d'autres personnes pour mener des projets. Les coursiers à vélo, quand ils sont arrivés chez Smart, c'est un très bel exemple de slasher, c'est-à-dire les premiers coursiers à vélo qu'on a eu chez Smart, ce ne sont pas des gens qui sont arrivés chez Smart pour faire coursier à vélo. C'est des gens qui étaient déjà chez Smart parce qu'ils faisaient d'autres activités et qui ont vu dans l'opportunité de faire des courses à vélo une opportunité de diversifier leurs activités et donc leurs revenus. Donc en fait, ils ont juste dit on est chez Smart pour ce qu'on fait aujourd'hui. Est-ce qu'il serait aussi possible de facturer des prestations de livraison à vélo? Puis ils en ont parlé à d'autres livreurs qui ont dit oh, mais ça a l'air intéressant. Et puis ça a fait boule de neige et on a vu apparaître des gens dont livreur à vélo était la seule activité, qu'elle soit principale ou accessoire, mais qui sont arrivés par après.
Smart disseminated its activities in different EU countries.
Le principe de partager une entreprise et d'offrir le statut le plus protecteur dans le pays pour pouvoir porter son projet a été adapté dans chacun des pays, mais avec les spécificités et les besoins de ce pays-là. C'est-à-dire la manière dont ça s'est organisé en Italie n'est pas du tout la même dont c'est organisé en Allemagne, parce que la meilleure protection sociale en Italie et en Allemagne n'est pas organisée de la même façon, par exemple. Mais les principes restent le même. C'est-à-dire que les personnes deviennent copropriétaires, ils sont sociétaires. Smart appartient à ces travailleurs d'une entreprise qu'ils partagent pour porter leur projet et qui leur permet d'avoir le statut qui, globalement, dans tous les pays que j'ai cités, le plus protecteur est le statut de salarié, même s'il se décline de façon différente dans chaque pays.
Lo que hacemos previamente es, antes de que llegue esa persona a la sede, contactar con la gente de la federación para que indicarles qué tipo de ayuda necesitan, ¿vale? Porque cuando tienen diferentes trabajos, o sea, nosotros tenemos un problema a la hora de afiliarlos, en qué sector los ponemos. Es un problema porque el sindicato está construido en sectores económicos, entendiendo que la mayoría de la gente solo está en una actividad. Hasta para rellenar la hoja de afiliación me supone un problema, porque me ponen todas las empresas donde están. Entonces, al final, pues, lo que hacemos es encuadrarlas en la que ellos consideran la principal. Evidentemente, cubrimos todas las necesidades de todas las plataformas. Si en alguna tiene algún problema, también lo hacemos.
To reach these workers, Tu Respuesta Sindical Ya uses all kinds of social media. They've also collaborated with grassroots associations. Their biggest achievement is the Writer's Law.
Otro éxito fundamental es haber constituido las secciones sindicales de Globo y de Deliveroo, y ahora el tema es que cuando se apruebe la ley Rider estaremos completamente legitimados y esa es la acción fundamental, haber constituido las secciones sindicales, que nosotros ya estamos dentro como sindicato.
What can be done at institutional level to support slash workers and platform workers?
Dans chaque pays, mais donc le chapeau, il est quand même au niveau européen, la multiplication aujourd'hui justement de nouveaux statuts, de sous-statuts. Moi, j'appelle des sous-statuts, c'est l'auto-entrepreneuriat en France, je crois que ça s'appelle micro-job en Allemagne. Donc, il faut justement arrêter de créer des statuts qui sont des choses des miroirs aux alouettes qui peuvent paraître attractifs justement pour les slasheurs. C'est simple, c'est des trucs, on s'inscrit en ligne, on paye quasi pas de cotisation, on peut facturer en toute légalité, mais en fait derrière, il n'y a aucune protection pour le travailleur. Donc le côté à court terme, ça a l'air intéressant. on a plus de net en poche, etc. Mais sur le long terme, c'est désastreux et directement pour les travailleurs qui ne s'assurent pas une sécurité personnelle et pour l'ensemble de la société, puisque les systèmes de sécurité collective comme la sécurité sociale sont basés sur le fait qu'un grand nombre de personnes y contribuent dans le but d'apporter quelque chose à ceux qui en ont besoin quand ils en ont besoin. S'il y a toute une série de gens qui s'extraient de ça pour des systèmes moins protecteurs et plus individualistes, ça va finir par poser un problème pour le système global qui sert à tout le monde.
El derecho sindical tiene que avanzar sobre el concepto de centro de trabajo. El derecho de información necesitamos poder extenderlo mucho más allá de que ellos accedan a páginas web, sino que dentro de la propia plataforma haya un canal de comunicación con sindicatos. La afiliación tiene que ser mucho más, tiene que servir más para blindar a la gente, porque el derecho del trabajo está pensado para compensar el poder que tienen las empresas. Entonces, en una plataforma el poder de la empresa es mucho más grande porque tú no tienes posibilidad de buscar la solidaridad de la gente. Entonces, ante mayor soledad, la única forma de compensar esto es que la afiliación tenga un poder mucho más grande de lo que tiene actualmente en la legislación española. Y eso también supone que hay que cambiar el sistema de representación sindical, que también está muy ligado al centro de trabajo, que también está muy ligado a una actividad bueno, de los comités de empresa. Hay que buscar otras fórmulas que sean más horizontales, que no estén tan enraizadas en centros de trabajo y en la empresa, sino que sean mucho más amplios y que la acción sindical sea mucho más genérica, no como... Y esto me quiero explicar bien, los delegados, los representantes legales de los trabajadores, nuestros delegados sindicales, tienen un campo muy específico dentro del comité de empresa. Y aquí esto también hay que abordarlo de otra forma, porque ya no vale.
Okay, so thank you very much. That was very interesting. I think that they summarized the results of our project. So my name is Pamela Meil. I'm from the Institute for Social Science Research in Munich, and I co-coordinated the work package on institutional frameworks in the Swirl project along with Vassil Kirov from the Bulgarian Academy of Sciences, and he's going to be joining us in the second half of this presentation. We were very lucky to be able to recruit some great discussants. The first one is Laurent Aujean, who's a policy officer in the unit responsible for social protection systems in the DG Employment, Social Affairs and Inclusion, after he did quite a few other things. And his position will enable us to have a broader view of how the EU is confronting the challenge of developing and enacting policy for changing landscapes of work across a diverse set of national frameworks. Our second discussant is Ricardo Rodriguez Contreras, who is a research manager at Eurofound and focuses on comparative industrial relations, social dialogue, and collective bargaining. Of course, Eurofound is well known for its research on occupations, working conditions, labor markets, the quality of work life, and so he will be able to put our small study into a larger context. So let me begin by trying to share my slides with you. I will put them on the, oops, great. So, okay. So let's start out with talking about what we were trying to do in this project. We had 6 different countries, Belgium, Bulgaria, France, Germany, Italy, and Spain. Of course, that represents quite a few different industrial relations regimes. And we wanted to see how they impact on protecting and representing slash workers or contingent workers in a comparative European perspective. So one of the main focuses was trying to, first of all, just trying to figure out what's happening in the countries now. What is the state of the situation? What is the state of the art in industrial relations systems at the moment? And then trying to identify emerging models and examining the experience of the organizations representing the interests of this very particular set of workers. And then we wanted to try to understand the interaction between systems as they exist now and new innovative strategies that are emerging. And of course, this is necessary because slash work goes beyond national boundaries. It involves platform work, freelance workers move around, and of course, the very difficult issue mentioned in a very in the emphasized way of the person in the video, the Spanish representative of the trade unions, is that it lacks a fixed place of work. So we also wanted to identify regional and local initiatives which are successful and what kinds of trends or lessons can be learned to provide influences for perhaps European-wide legislation and guidelines, or for being able to find cross-border solutions. So we started out with obviously a range of different kinds of research issues. And one of the basic ones was just asking ourselves, can traditional industrial relations systems regulate modern forms of work? And if not, or if so, what do they need to be doing to adjusting to the new situations? So we also wanted to know how slash work affects traditional models. So slash work is something very special because the workers have different jobs, they have different contracts, they have different identities, they have different kinds of employment identifications of whether or not they're self-employed or whether or not dependent employees and so forth. And so we wanted to ask ourselves, do industrial relations systems, are they effective responding to these needs? What are their strategies to respond to these needs? And also, of course, what are the differences between countries? Because when you look at industrial relations systems and when you look at institutional frameworks, obviously, one of the things you're going to be looking at is that in all the different countries, they have developed historically differently. The institutions have developed in their particular frameworks, and they should differ with each other. They should maybe be responding differently, but or in fact, are they actually showing a kind of convergence in the way they're dealing with these systems or not dealing with these systems? So we wanted to ask also if the actors who were involved in regulating work and protecting workers, have these shifted? Are there new actors emerging? And how do these deviate from traditional forms of collective bargaining? So another issue is, are issues that are usually associated with industrial relations research and bargaining still valid today? Or should other issues be addressed? Do we need the same categories? Should we be concentrating on the same issues? Traditionally, industrial relations systems, of course, because they want to negotiate, they want to set norms. So they are also dealing with things like wages and social protections and so forth. Are there new issues that are coming up that are more relevant? What happens to the old ones? And finally, we asked ourselves, what are the successful experiments of regulation and social innovation at the national and local levels? So we specifically tried to find pockets of initiatives or new strategies and also confront ourselves with them and see what they mean in the long run. So we had a couple of different methods that we applied for this research in our small project. The first one was actually 6 national reports that each country delivered based mainly on desk research and literature. And these provided an overview of the existing models of regulation, policy, and industrial relations in the respective countries, and an examination of how these systems have responded to the challenges of needs of workers. Then we asked for a second set of reports from 5 of the countries, Bulgaria, France, Germany, and Italy, and Spain, and we conducted interviews with key stakeholders. So this second empirical research was focusing on the new actions and initiatives, the challenges, how the organizations are changing, what kinds of new strategies they're following, what kinds of new experiments that they were involved in. And we also had a wider net because we were able to not only look at very traditional institutions of industrial relations, such as trade unions, but we were also able to look at cooperatives and other new forms of interest representation that are growing. And so in the end, we had interviews, a number of interviews in various countries, and we had 31 in total. So, as sociologists, of course, we're always very interested in actors, because we know that it is the actors who, through their agency, enact change, enact policy, that they have different power positions, that they have different interests. And so we wanted to see how the different actors of industrial relations operate in these various structures of trying to deal with the new issues of new forms of work and the changing work landscape. So, okay, traditionally, let's say we have unions, the state, companies or employers, and we have individuals who are workers, who are the main actors in the system, and that traditionally work involved the unions and the employers trying to negotiate or collectively bargain to develop fair contracts and social protections and support for workers. The state was, of course, involved in regulating work, and the workers were involved in making their interests known. So the thing was that there's always been diversity in these groups, but the diversity is really sort of exploding. So employers, you have, of course, platforms, you have subcontractors, and in fact, it's hard sometimes to know who the employers are. Then, of course, under the workers, you have, as before, dependent workers, self-employed, freelance, temp agency workers, in Italy, subordinated workers. You have slash workers who work both offline and online. And these workers existed previously. It's just that the balance is sort of changing, and so that there's more diversity also in the workforce, at the same time that there's a diversity amongst the employers. And there has always been in companies, obviously, diversity with different sectors, different sizes, and different types of jobs and labor protection that they offered workers, but this diversity is also growing.
Excuse me, Pamela, if you could just speak a little louder for the translation. Thank you so much.
Okay. So, and the unions have also seen an explosion in the types of representation that is in their landscapes. So there's grassroots initiatives, also, as we know quite often from the couriers and food delivery workers. There's cooperatives, professional associations, which have always existed, but have taken on a different role, various kinds of blogs and Facebook groups representing different kinds of professional workers. So another actor that has taken on more and more importance in this constellation has also been the courts of labor law. We also talked about that yesterday with regard to Spain, where this has taken on a really very great responsibility in terms of regulation. And then, of course, there's the EU on top of it all, because since all of these national frameworks are so diverse, and it's difficult to have a kind of basis of social protection, the EU has gotten active trying to develop different kinds of social policy to make it harder also for employers to bypass regulation, for instance, or to cover this more diverse set of the workforce. Is that okay, Nico?
This is way better.
Okay.
Absolutely perfect. Thank you for everybody.
Okay. So, just a couple of findings. One is that, on the one hand, you have this sort of major contradiction rising. You have slash workers who, by definition, have multiple jobs, multiple employers, employment outside of standardized contract arrangements, and perhaps, that's not always the case, but quite often, more than one occupational identity. On the other side, you have the industrial relations systems and interest representation structures, which are geared toward fixed workplaces in particular regional or national settings, particular employers, particular occupations, and achieving standardized and fair contract arrangements for work that protect workers, usually through the instruments of collective bargaining. But you need negotiation partners for this, and you have to be able to set norms for this. And it's difficult if you don't have an employer to talk to. So, generally speaking, what we found was the lack of place-bound employment and the contingent nature of work, not surprisingly, created immense challenges for the industrial relations actors and their ability to regulate. And so therefore, there actually very little regulation has actually taken place dealing with this specific issue of the slash worker and the contingent worker. Collective bargaining has also been extremely hard to achieve for contingent workforces across all of the countries. And of course, there are some exceptions, which we often hear about, that has to do with place-bound and very mobilized workers, such as delivery workers or food couriers or drivers. And the word here is place-bound, because these people are actually have pretty bad working conditions quite often, but also have place-bound organized structures and identifiable employers. One of the things you need to have collective bargaining and the kind of responses that usual types of industrial relations actors can give you. Self-employed workers or freelance workers rarely achieve regulations for social protection outside of already existing structures. There are small pockets of successful initiatives that we can identify, but generally speaking, the existing structures are things like professional organizations or certain occupational groups that were able to identify their interests and get good representation for themselves in certain countries, such as journalists, and certain self-employed workers who have existed for a long time. So in this way, what you might be seeing is that even in very different institutional frameworks, Germany, Italy, Spain, and Belgium, that with regard to these particular types of slash workers, there's more and more a movement toward market-mediated orientations away from state-controlled structures when it comes to regulating the contingent workforce. And in general, we also saw less organized conflict and actually a greater role of labor law in courts and mediation processes. Again, some exceptions to this rule, such as food couriers and other pockets of resistance. And France, in some ways, was also an exception to this rule because they did have a greater tendency toward organized conflicts and strikes than the other countries in the project. So, moving on to the next set of findings, Vassil is going to take over here and also talk about policy recommendations.
Thank you, Pamela. Yeah, thank you. So I would like probably before starting the second part of the presentation, just to remind that our report is available on the website of the project. And if you are interested in concrete cases, illustrations, details, you can go and find them there. We don't have time here to develop, but I should only say that some of the very interesting initiatives that have been already addressed in this report have been further deepened, and you'll hear much more about in the second part of today's webinar after the break. So I'll continue talking about our findings. And actually, when we talk about regulations, we try to see different levels and different producers of regulation. On the one hand, the national states, the legislation, and actually it was said already, there is a large variety. And actually, when we just seen this short video with the interview of the president of the Smart Cooperative, he was talking about this multiplication of categories and subcategories of the statut and the sous-statut. And I think we see this consistently in all these countries. They have more and more different forms addressing different categories, subcategories. Some of them are older, like les intermittents du spectacle, but some of them are completely new. Some of them address, for example, very short contracts of workers in agriculture, etc., etc. And the whole question is to what extent these legislative responses can bring a solution. And of course, there is a big debate. Do we need a kind of third category or not? And I think we, after that, in the discussion, we will have a chance to talk a little bit about. As it was just said by Pamela, a second stream of regulation in Europe now comes through the courts, labor courts or general courts, because not in all the country there are specialized labor courts. And actually, we have seen that in many of the countries covered by this research, and I think in generally speaking, in many other European countries, more and more court decisions that shape in a way these regulatory practices. I just mentioned, for example, in 2020, the German labor court ruled that platform workers can be considered regular employees under certain conditions. In Italy, there was a judgment of the Court of Appeal of Turin in 2019, following an appeal, and this judgment established that riders, for delivery riders, have the right to receive as payment a specific wage level calculated on the salary of employees set by the collective agreement for the logistic and transport sector. So I won't continue with all these examples, but I think we have clearly seen in the industrial relations during the recent year, there is this notion of juridization, and there are some scholars advocating that probably now, together with the mobilization, the collective mobilization, juridization and the use of legal instruments, sometimes for individual cases, take much bigger importance. And it's actually also the case about slashers and contingent workers, because very often the whole story, again, I'll quote the president of SMART in this moment, he said there are different statuses, but some of them offer better protection, better social protection. And actually, very often, these court debates are about the concrete status that could bring better protection. And finally, a third stream of regulations related not to the state, not to the courts, but a different kind of, let's say, private regulatory practices, different codes of conduct, like in Germany, a code of conduct for platform work, but not only. Of course, here we know that non-binding practices on the one hand cannot enforce, cannot assure compliance. On the other hand, they can be probably some cases a useful beginning. Of course, we know that a lot of, for example, platforms are also very sensitive about their image. So I'll make a parallel. For example, we know very well that there are some instruments like the OECD guidelines for the multinational companies that are not binding themselves, but that can play, and it is shown in the literature, that play a very important role just because of the fact that those big players are sometimes really careful about their image. And I'll stop here with these few examples, and I'll pass now to the last part of our presentation, which is about few conclusions and few policy recommendations about regulation and about collectivity for slash workers. And of course, I think it was one of the red lines of our presentation. The keywords is really the diversity. And it is a major challenge. And we have seen yesterday the wonderful presentation of our Spanish colleague about the different types of slash workers. And we know that there are some of them doing multiple occupations because of the necessity, because to make their rents, to pay their bills. Other ones are much more interested about their professional development, personal development, combination of hobbies, etc. So of course this plays a role. How to encompass, how to reconcile all these different figures, and how to find a balance of benefits, flexibility, and risks of exploitation. And actually, we have seen that in practice, empirically, very often workers engaged in slash work or individuals engaged in slash work are trying to, at the very individual level, to find such kind of balance. But of course, such balance could be definitely ensured by better regulation by different providers of regulation. And of course, we have, to this report, to this analysis of different national situations, and actually I should say that also all these countries have not been selected, they have been selected also in order to illustrate all these various European social and industrial relations and employment models that we know. Of course, there are different, we can observe different legal systems, different initiatives that are addressing, for example, the prevention of unlawful dismissals, that try to defend in a way to protect the rights of self-employed workers. And of course, it's not easy because even I have seen, for example, personally, when we organized recently a debate here in Bulgaria between different key actors related to slash workers. And for example, within the unions, there are traditional voices that still say those self-employed people, they are not target for trade unions. Of course, there are other trade unionists that say, probably now the labor market is changing. So we should think, and we should also see how we can encompass and how. And on the other side, a lot of expectations, for example, because freelance workers in some countries have some bodies of representation, some association. In other countries, and especially on the eastern side of Europe, very often they don't have such organizations still. And actually, I think one of the additional contributions of this project was that we also succeeded to put together sometime at the table people representing those different groups. And I'll pass now, Pamela, could you change? I'll pass now to our last slide. As it was said, there were some initiatives, especially bringing regulation to local place-bound platform work, to those people that can be seen on the streets, that deliver food, that clean offices or homes, etc. Much less about all those that deliver their services that could be a simple click or could be very sophisticated production of software or whatever on the other side of the world. Of course, very often when we speak about very, how to say, highly qualified work, there are the arguments that those individuals probably have some abilities to negotiate for themselves, but it's not so easy. We have seen again here on the Balkans. I'm very happy that in the audience there are also the people interested in the development of those type of work in the Balkans. People that work for clients in the US, in Canada, they work during the night because they should be at the disposal. So of course they are probably they receive decent payment, but part of their conditions are not ideal, and they are under a big stress. And we have seen that something probably not very original, but we have said that in countries that have stronger organizations of employees, stronger unions, it's probably a little bit less, it's a bit probably more probable to find situation where can support individuals engaged in slash work. We know that in countries with less developed unionism, again, as is the case very often in Central and Eastern Europe, is difficult because trade unions don't have sometimes enough resources, so they should on the one hand address the needs of their members, and probably their members that are easily identified in a particular location, large companies, etc. But also how to find resources and time and energy to address the needs of those slashers that are dispersed. And finally, we have reflected about probably the need of some harmonization, the need of probably some EU intervention. And we know that from other initiatives, it could be a possibility because there is not only a large diversity of cases of slashers, but there is also a large diversity of categories, of legal regulations, of court decisions across the EU. So probably here, something around the figures of employee, of self-employed, of decent work could help the whole story and could bring more decent work to slashers. And here I'll stop. Of course, as we said, we'll be very happy to receive all your questions and comments in the Q&A session. But now we'll make a first round, and I'll give the floor first to Laurent Aujean, and after that to Ricardo Contreras, to react on our findings, to bring us to the perspective of their respective institutions, the European Commission, Eurofound. And after that, we'll have a second round, debates, and during this second round, as yesterday, we would like to address your questions, your concerns, so please be active. And now I'll pass the floor to Laurent Aujean. Please, you have 10 minutes.
Many thanks, Vassil. Hello to everyone. According to the program, I thought Ricardo would start, but it's perfectly fine for me if I do. So it's a very interesting angle that has been the one of the Swirl project, co-founded by my colleagues from the Social Dialogue Unit. Indeed, it's also a new term, a new concept for me, slashers. And but obviously it's not necessarily a new phenomenon. I think it was very important that you highlighted also both today and in the report the diversity of let's say workers in such situation of having several occupations or jobs or statuses. It's not new to some sectors such as cultural workers, musicians, and a number of occupation and sectors. I wouldn't say that there are specific EU initiatives targeting this particular group, but for sure the issue of contingent workers and those with uncertain labor market status, uncertain access to social protection has been a key issue that the EU has tried to address recently. So I would like today to focus rather on what's the core problem for my unit, meaning access to social protection. So it may be a very specific angle that does not, cover all areas related to, for instance, working conditions, labor law, other aspects of labor market segmentation across, some EU member states. But indeed, it's a perspective that I would like to share with you. So, I mean, making sure that precarious employment situation is avoided for most workers is part of the European Pillar of Social Rights adopted some years ago. And there are still a number of EU initiatives that I mentioned quickly, but I will not go into the detail. Yesterday, you discussed the future EU initiatives on ensuring that platform workers have better working conditions. So my colleague Tobias talked about it, about the ongoing consultation of social partners organization. We also have now a solid labor law with regard to fixed-term contract, part-time workers, temporary agency workers, so those 3 directives in this area, as well as a new directive on transparent and predictable working conditions. I think it's still important, even if this later is not yet fully implemented by member states. Well, it's perhaps even more important to mention it, because in a way, this is the moment that member states have to really, define the ways this directive will be fully implemented and enforced in their legislation. And to some extent, it's a very useful legal tool to improve the situation of precarious workers generally, including new forms of work, 0-hour contract workers, etc. Also, perhaps I have to say that in another framework, meaning the European semester, the governance, strategy when it comes to economic, employment, social affairs in Europe, we also issued often recommendations to member states in order to avoid labor market segmentation. And now, obviously, my focus, as I say today, will not be on job protection or working conditions or collective bargaining coverage, but rather on social protection. Next week, I also would like to mention that the Social Protection Committee will adopt its triennial pension adequacy report. It's relevant insofar as, let's say, it also recognizes that, sustained efforts are needed to ensure adequate coverage and opportunities to accrue pension rights for non-standard workers and self-employed. So it's obviously focused on pensions, but I think it's being you know, one of the main also social protection expenditures in the EU, and one of the basic rights that all workers, you know, should have access to in order to spend their later years out of poverty. I think it's quite important that I also mention that to you. It will be adopted by the Social Protection Committee next week. So now focusing on access to social protection, I would like to just guide you again through what the Commission and then Council adopted a few years ago, meaning in November 2019, a specific Council recommendation on access to social protections for workers and the self-employed. I think it's fair to say that it was very much focused on temporary contract workers, or let's say all those in non-standard form of employment, defined as those not working with indefinite duration contract for a single employer. In the end, if you add up all those with a temporary contract, or working part-time, or being self-employed, you reach more than 40% of the overall labor market. So then it gives you a kind of let's say qualifier about whether the rest are really standard. You know, it's true that more and more people work in those form non-standard, but obviously with very diverse forms themselves, because having, for instance, a permanent type of contract but on a part-time basis is obviously very different from, you know, having recurrent form of temporary contract with never access to a more stable form of employment. Same for self-employed. As you know, for some of them, for some self-employed, it's obviously a choice. For others, it's simply a second choice situation that they have not, you know, they were not willing to have, but are solo self-employed with very short duration contract with some form of one or several employers sometimes. In the case of meaning bogus self-employed, which is not the majority, but so we tried in a few years ago to have the member states' commitment to make sure that most workers, and especially those lacking currently social protection or some form of social protection for some branches, have all the opportunity to have a legal access but also effective access. So there are four main area of let's say progress that member states committed to make. They are related to formal coverage, to make sure that you know, all workers have legal access to contribute and benefit from social protection branches, so what we call formal coverage. Then focusing on effective coverage to make sure that the rules, entitlements, qualifying period, waiting period, etc., do not create obstacles to effective coverage by those social protection branches. I'm talking here about unemployment benefits, sickness benefits, family-related leaves and benefits, survivor benefits and old age pensions, accident at work and occupational schemes, as well as disability benefits, just to make sure what I'm talking about. Then a third dimension was adequacy, to make sure that they provide, you know, basic replacement to have a decent standard of living, avoiding poverty. And then the fourth dimension is the one of transparency, to make sure that sufficient information is provided, that workers, you know, are fully informed about what are their rights, obligations, their entitlements. And it was quite interesting to hear in the video the intervention of the persons from SMART, also mentioning that obviously it's sometimes very appealing when you can register very quickly on a platform on a website to have some form of contract that in the end, does not provide the social protection that is needed and that should be guaranteed. And so here, the issue of transparency, the issue of providing information is obviously a key, crucial one. I mean, people do not necessarily think in the very long run about their pension schemes, but at least thinking about how you would be covered in case you lose your job, your income source, in case you have an accident. I mean, all the basic, in case you have a child. I mean, all the basic, social protection that that are needed for working life of persons, unemployment, sickness, family-related benefits, etc., are really important. So member states are supposed to come up with a national plan implementing this recommendation by the 15th of May. So this seminar is very timely because next week, basically, they should all submit to the Commission and to the Social Protection Committee their national plan for implementation. There was some form of guidance, let's say, endorsed by the Social Protection Committee, what those national plans should include. We suggested that they should include a diagnosis about what the situation of coverage by various groups is by social protection systems in their country. They should also draw the lessons from the COVID-19 crisis and the way some of the temporary measures that were taken, sometimes exceptional measures to ensure income support to various groups. Sometimes in some countries they provided exceptional support for self-employed, also for those that were not covered before for some form of income support, because people falling unemployed during the crisis, did not necessarily have all the entitlement duration to get normally employment support. Also some specific categories such as domestic workers, seasonal workers in the agriculture, as well as work in the cultural sector benefited from exceptional support during the crisis. Many measures may not become permanent, we know that already, but let's say that we push member states to also reflect on this, to what extent some of the exceptional support that was provided during the COVID-19 crisis could become permanent, how to make these measures more structural. Now, another thing that we suggested member states to have in their national reports of implementation of the recommendation would be what are the policy objectives that they pursue, what are the specific measures that they would take to make sure to implement this council recommendation. And the last part was more related to what are needed from the EU to support member states to make sure that these recommendations is enforced. Let's say it's not a hard law, as you know, in this area. The EU has not strong, legal competence in the area of social protection. Still, there is a very powerful, let's say, policy objective. It's the first time there is this joint council recommendation in such an area. There were a number of mutual learning events that took place, just after the adoption of the directive, to make sure that all member states know what has been done in other member states to give, let's say, to make progress in the 4 areas I mentioned of formal coverage, effective coverage, adequacy, and transparency. And so we still that it's still a very powerful, let's say, policy instrument, this recommendation. I also would like to mention that since its adoption, we also adopted, or let's say the Social Protection Committee endorsed a monitoring framework, which can be a useful tool that I could also share with participants today. It's online on the website of the Social Protection Committee and DG Employment Social Affairs of the Commission. What is it? So it's a set of key indicators with some data sources, etc. The same that were used in some of the analyses on slash workers, meaning so-called EU SILT, the Survey on Income and Living Conditions, and the EU Labour Force Survey. But it's also about national data about the typical, entitlements for various type of workers to the various social protection branches I mentioned. So it shows that a number of people in non-standard employment do not have access to unemployment benefits, sickness benefits, or pensions also, as well as the situation of self-employed. It's also about checking to what extent, based on sources such as EU Silk, various categories have access or not effective access to any type of benefits across Europe, but also to check what is the situation in terms of at risk of poverty. We know that non-standard employees have a higher risk of poverty or highest risk of severe material deprivation rate. Also to see to what extent social transfers avoid poverty, and we see that at least there is a role for social protection systems, because the poverty after social transfers for these groups is indeed lower than before social transfers. So it is reassuring to some extent. It's not necessarily true in all member states. So it's also some of the type of indicators we look at when we, let's say, monitor the situation of member states in the frame of Council recommendations adopted in the frame of the European semester. So there are a number of indicators that we used, and there are also contextual indicators, and the share of workers having a secondary job is one of these examples. So a key indicator which is used in the report produced in the frame of the Swirl project. To finish my first intervention, just would like to repeat that indeed slashers, how do they fit in this context? I would say that what's important to focus on is indeed that everyone with a job should have access to social protection, and those with several employment, let's say, our basic position is that every work should count towards your social protection rights. And I would be curious about also the position of SMART, for instance, about that. To what extent those that have, a first employee contract that often rely on that for their social protection, and that have, complementary form of self-employed activity, to what extent is fine in the end, or should all work count towards your social protection rights? Indeed, it would be important both to ensure the financial basis of social protection systems, as well as the coverage and adequacy, that those that rely on multiple jobs, get some social protection rights through all those jobs, and also contribute through all those jobs. It may challenge a bit the way, things are organized across member states, because people may not necessarily want to further contribute through their let's say complementary self-employment activity. I must recognize here that also I'm not the expert on that, so I'm fully listening to the expertise of colleagues involved in this seminar. And perhaps just to finish on the COVID-19 situation, we have seen that there was exceptional support provided in many member states. Soon we will publish some specific analysis that has been done by our European Social Protection Network on to what extent social protection has been extended to some, groups that were not covered in the past. Clearly, it has been the case in a number of countries. Now, at the same time, as I mentioned, we know that often it was more done on an exceptional basis, meaning that most of the measures may not translate into more structural reforms. Still, it is what we would expect for member states to do in the national plans for implementing the Council recommendation. Part of the European Pillar of Social Rights Action Plan adopted in March, we also announced we will launch a high-level expert group on the future of welfare. I know also, Vassil, you participated to the former high-level expert group on the digitalization of the labor market. So for sure, we will try to take the recommendations of this expert group fully in line when it comes to the future of welfare. And I would like to thank you for the invitation again, and I'm fully available for questions later on. So I'd stop there. I hope it was still clear for you, and many thanks for the invitation again.
Thank you very much, Laurent. It was very useful, and you reminded what the EU is doing at the level of social protection, about all these initiatives to ensure accessible and effective social protection. And you also addressed a question to SMART, and probably after in the second round I'll ask somebody from SMART, Sarah or somebody else to answer this question. Now I'll give the floor directly to Ricardo, and just probably one small remark. I think that a lot of things seems to be done at national level, but I have the feeling, and actually this was one of the recommendations of our high-level group 2 years ago, more and more activities that are performed transnationally. And sometimes all those self-employed and freelancers have big problems when they perform work in Poland, in Spain, in Germany, how to address, how to tackle. And one of our recommendations was actually to kind of one-stop shop about that. And here probably the Commission could play a role. But now, Ricardo, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you, Vassil. Thank you to SMART and the partners in this project for inviting me, inviting Eurofound. Well, basically, I would say, first of all, that we have not researched a lot in what you call slash workers, what again is a new term for me too. I'm happy to get into this new technology. Secondly, I'm not going to say anything about the regulatory framework, basically, because you have already studied, analyzed it in the report, and this is not our role, basically, to Eurofound. Of course, we provide policy recommendations as Tobias suggested in policy masters. Basically, I'm going to share a presentation. So I will. I'm not the one.
Excuse me, Ricardo. Thank you so much, but could you speak a little louder or closer to the microphone, because the translation is a little difficult right now. I'm so sorry to interrupt you.
No problem. No, I fully understand.
Oh, so that's really better. Thank you so much.
I try to avoid this device, but in the end, it's quite useful. So basically, I bring here different pieces of research that we have done in the issue that we are talking today about contingency work, non-standard functional work, slash workers, etc., etc. So probably I will divide my presentation in two different strands, and I will say something in the end about some kind of conclusions. The first thing is something that has been already mentioned at the beginning of this session about what is the tendencies in terms of the labor market in the European Union over the past years. We did also the same exercise a couple of years before the pandemic outbreak in terms of trying to better understand what are the tendencies particularly comparing what we call standard forms of employment and non-standard forms of employment. And then because at that time we were discussing, if you remember well, about the future of work. So it's much more the personal world. I think the pandemic has changed a lot our perception of work and even about the future too. But basically, what has also been said before this morning, the standard employment, meaning the permanent full-time employment subject to labor law, is still the dominant, quite dominant in Europe, and the non-standard employment, maybe with the exception of part-time work. Of course, over the past decade has been growing, but to a rather limited extent. So really, we cannot. These figures, of course, are before the pandemic, but I think the tendency is more or less quite consistent with the presentation this morning from the analysis from ACTA. I think so. What happened here when you see this? Okay, it's not really a huge problem, the non-standard form of work, but if we compare these labor force statistics with other surveys, particularly with the last available wave of the European Working Conditions Survey, we find some elements that aggregate data are not showing us. So we see an increase in part-time work, increase also in voluntary part-time work of particularly men, shortening duration of fixed-term work, also a high share of involuntary fixed-term work, and an increase, of course, in part-time self-employment. So there are some elements behind the statistics that show us that something is happening in terms of the quality of work, even in terms of the forms of employment. And this is influencing the quality of work. And this is quite, I think, important now that last week, we have had the Porto Summit, and with this re-strengthening of the European Pillar of Social Rights. So this is why we started to analyze what we call 6 years ago, new forms of employment, because we saw that behind the statistics, there are something else. So we, sorry, I'm trying to, what we did in 2013, 2014 was a study based on 66 case studies along maybe most of them member states, and we tried to identify, to map what are these, what we call at that time, new forms of employment. We did something which is not based particularly in the employment status of the workers as such. We identified 9 tendencies, 9 trends of these new forms of employment, based basically in 3 variables. You see in this slide, we have on the one hand the employment relationship, and the work pattern is one of the variables, and the other one is the employment status. But based on this first classification, we identified 3 main trends. The first one is about those relationships, formal relationships, that are different from the very well-established one-to-one employment relationship. I think that Pamela this morning also mentioned about that. This is a new phenomenon, phenomena that has been increasing over the past years. The second one is, of course, I will talk about this later on. The second one is those employment relationships that really show very uncommon work patterns or work organization, basically taking into account the well-established criteria that Ruben, the Spanish man, told this morning. So time and place. To what extent employment is challenged by changes in time and place. We produced a couple of years ago a relevant report with the ILO, which was called Working Anytime, Anywhere, and trying to refer to these new aspects of work. And the third criteria was this type of employment that probably smart cooperative fall into this type. So which implies some kind of cooperation among self-employed basically, or some combination of these. What is important is we found these 9 tendencies. You see, probably you're very familiar with some of them. And it means also that that it's possible a combination of more than one. So it's also important to see that this is much more, it is a theoretical construction. So as I said before, we took into account these 3 main elements, I would say dimensions: employment dimension, the employment relationship, the work patterns in terms of what now at that time we identified the discontinuity, the intermittent work, non-conventional fixed term, and this type. And it was irrespective of the workplace, irrespective of the sector and occupation, irrespective of the legal basis. That's important. As I said before, of course, this is a theoretical construction. That is a combination. It could be a combination. A specific employment relationship can fall into more than one of these categories. For example, platform work is a clear example about that. It could be part of portfolio work. And these are the 9 categories. I'm not going to detail. This was published 6 years ago. It's available on our webline. What I would like to highlight here is to say, okay, basically contingency work or slash work, the market in red are the 3 categories in which you can find this type of work. So what we call ICT-based mobile work, the platform work, and the portfolio work. So these are the 3 categories. We could also add, to some extent, collaborative employment, but really this category differs a lot among the member states. So you can have, for instance, in Spain, cooperatives which are employees, all of them. And the first 5 employee sharing, job sharing, voucher-based work, interim management. As I said before, we only try to identify what was in member state. Not all these categories were spread out in all member states, not at all. In some countries, we didn't find these categories. But most of them include the employees and not self-employed. I go quickly because I have some slides to show you. Also, I'm not going to detail, but at that time, the study also showed that there was concerns about working conditions and particularly social protection of these workers in these 9 categories of work. The market in red are the categories in which there are some problems, concerns, gaps, unclear definition, etc., even in terms of working conditions, stress, work intensity, etc., etc. I'm not going too much in detail about that. What we did in last year, during the pandemic, because we was planning to do that probably, is to take this study in 2014, 2015, it was published in 2015, 16, and try to follow up to what extent these 9 forms of employment have evolved over years. Basically, we were not last year. We didn't made a new analysis. We just tried, because it was difficult time to do some time of field work. Well, we only asked to our national correspondents in all member states to what extent these forms are spread out or to have become prevalent or not. And this is what we found. This report is also published in our website. We see that, for instance, ICT-based mobile work, which was identified in 60% of the countries of the member states in 2014, is now probably the most prevalent form of work. It's totally spread out in all member states, so now exists in all countries. And probably the second thing is that platform work that in 2014 was not very recognized, at least, or acknowledged as a new form of work, now has been a striking increase of platform work in all member states. Other forms of work also are become more prevalent across Europe. Anyway, this type of this mapping that we did, this analysis that we did last year, we must take into account because we cannot compare totally the 2014 study with this one. The underlying question was different. Even in 2014, 2015, a couple of member states were not included in the study, Malta and Estonia, if I'm not mistaken. So the conclusion from this part is basically that you see that platform work is really probably the most striking new forms of employment in 6 years. And the conclusion is really that these new forms of employment, these unconventional patterns of work have been spread out across Europe a lot during the last 5 years. Now, I will present some findings from a study that is much more address people, person workers with multiple jobs. This is how we call it, but I try to follow the terminology in the project, and I will talk about slash workers. This is a report that we published last year too, using the labor force survey and also the European working conditions survey. We made a comparative analysis. Unfortunately, the data that we used last year were the last wave of the European Working Conditions Survey from 2015, was published in 2015, because last year we started the new wave of the European Working Conditions Survey, but we have to stop it. It was a disaster because of the pandemic, so more than 9,000 interviews already done. So has been, but now again, I can tell you that we have recovered from this disaster, and we have started the new survey, and the field work is currently taking place in all member states and also candidate countries. So we have to reinvent ourselves in terms of surveys. Basically, this is a publication I said before in 2020, and it's available. So I'm not going to again to tell too much about it, but I will try to highlight some things, and probably one of the most important findings in this study, which is about the role of the women in this slash work. So basically, the first thing I think is also included in the different studies, the different research that the project has done, is about that there is still a relatively small proportion of European workforce that holds down a second job. It's about 4%, was 4% in 2018. It represents about more than 9 million workers, which is not too bad. So it's an important amount of people doing a second job. I was passing a bit during the labor force statistics last week to prepare this meeting. I see that, of course, the pandemic has slightly reduced these percentages virtually in every single member state and in all occupations. I will come back about occupations later. But, well, it's quite consistent with the developments in the labor market in the European Union because of the effects of the impact of the pandemic. What we can say is that here, so maybe, yeah, well, I will come back later. So I'm sorry for the figures because the figures are not showing up, but these graphs show that most slash workers are either employees in both first and second job, which is important. So more than 50%, 52% of the slash workers are are employees in the first and the second job, and almost 30%, 29% of 30% of the slash workers have a first job as employee and a second job as self-employed. So this is basically the most important picture that we want to show. By contrast, the combinations between self-employed in the first job and self-employed in the second job, or self-employed and in the first job and employee in the second job, are quite less common. So basically, this is the picture we have. Of course, even these figures are from 2018. In 2019, we saw an increase of the proportion of slash workers that, as I said before, has been reduced before of the pandemic. This is the map. The figures you see is the percentage, the ratio of slash workers in every member states, well, at that time including the UK. What is relevant here is to show that women comprise 50%, more than 55% of slash workers in some countries, Estonia, France, Luxembourg, and on the other hand, male are predominant in other countries like Greece, Hungary, Ireland. Probably just to say something about these figures is that slash work is much more gender balanced in the all 15 member states, and male work is more predominant in the 13 member states.
Ricardo, excuse me, just 2 minutes probably, because we need after that to have 10 minutes for the discussion. So,
sorry?
I said, could you go to your conclusions, because we need to leave 10 minutes here for the discussion. Yeah.
Okay, conclusions. I still have many things to say. Well, I have to say this because this is important. It's part of the conclusion. I can skip the conclusion, but say something about. So we have found in our studies basically this gender disparity in the slash work, which is probably the most important thing. So we analyzed the occupational profiles in the structure of jobs of slash work. We see that there is more female work in elementary occupations than male work. Male work is much more predominant in the higher level of occupations. So this is based in the level 4 survey, but also in the European Working Conditions Survey. So in fact, as an example, a clear example is that the top occupation for women is basically cleaners and helpers, and also personal care, while the male work is much more managers, professionals, and other type of high professions. I'll go quickly. I will say that skip quintiles in terms of salary incomes. Again, we see the same gender disparity than in the occupational aspects. So women are less paid than the men. If we analyze the quintile structure, So basically, the male/workers actually do much better than average, even that the total employment, the total overall employment in the European Union. This is about income quintile again. So I was planning to tell you more things about this, Vassil, but if you are really limiting my time, I will go to the conclusions. Basically, some ideas. First of all, employment is becoming more diverse in the European Union. This could be because of many factors, but according to our experience, according to our research, flexibility probably is the main tendency over the past decades in the European Union. So what happens is that the standard employment is not simply being replaced by non-standard work. So there are many other forms of employment that are on race, and then of course it requires some policies accordingly to these tailored needs. Heterogeneity probably is the most important consequence of these new forms of employment and unconventional work patterns. Because the second point is, of course, this is a symptom of a structural change in the labor market. As I said before, time, workplaces are changing clearly, digitalization, etc., etc., etc. But in this new landscape that is emerging, there is, of course, some win-win situations in some new forms of employment, clearly. So because workforce is demanding that, for instance, in the case of slash workers, are some professionals, etc., that want to have a second job and to work, as also happens, for instance, in the platform work, as was discussed yesterday. So platform work is not totally homogeneous picture. But also we have found quite evidence about concerns about problems and gaps concerning working conditions, health and safety issues, etc., etc. So in the case of slash work, again, as in other forms of work, it presents positive and negative features. Yesterday was a discussion about why, for instance, according to the figures in the labor force survey, there are more slash work in the Nordic countries than in the South, which is something really to be further researched. It was suggested, for instance, about the influence or the impact of informal economy. I'm not sure about that. I think that this is a multifaceted phenomenon. This is much more complex than this explanation. But really, it's something that must be further researched. And my last slide, Vassil, I promise you, this is the very last one. Yeah, this is much more about, okay, probably institutional frameworks and regulatory frameworks. So something that we have no time to show you is the problem concerning the slash workers and working time regulations. And this is, we found really a gap. So we can deduce this because most of the slash workers, most, I can give you the figures, is in the report anyway. So they show you, they show that they work more than 48 hours a week, which is basically the working time directive provisions. Of course, there are some the possibility to average this on about weeks and months, and even the rest period of 11 hours between two periods of work. It's not, in principle, is not followed by these slash workers because they are basically working more than 10, 11 hours, particularly the self-employed one, which is quite consistent with other research saying that the self-employees do not report this type of work. So the thing is, okay, to what extent, because I fully agree with my colleagues from the Commission, we have very solid floor or working conditions right and labor rights in the European Union, but to what extent some of the regulatory framework, particularly in working time, is really fit for purpose for dealing with, for coping with facing these problems. It's not only about the purpose, it's about the enforcements as such, it's about the coverage. How can we capture how can we really cover these workers? Laurent has said before also the important work that is ongoing about the social protection of these workers that are not sufficiently protected so far. As I said before, the gender perspective is quite critical. When you see behind the statistics or look at it a little bit in depth, this is really a problem. I'll say also that collective bargaining is very, very important. And I hope that, of course, the reinforcement of the European Pillar of Social Rights and other policies or regulatory frameworks like the minimum wage, the potentially minimum wage directive could contribute to the issue of improving poor working conditions as we found in this our research. So thank you very much. And that's all.
Thank you, Ricardo, for this very rich presentation with a lot of very important policy pointers. And sure, there have been already a lot of reactions in the audience. So please, could you provide this presentation and we'll put it to the website or we'll provide it to all the participants. Now, we have still 3 minutes to the end of the session. We should do a lot of things. There is one, Sarah wanted to answer very quickly the question of Laurent. I'll give the floor to Laurent, Ricardo, and Pamela for very quick reactions. And there are 2 questions from the audience, from Barbara Stacher. And there are, how do these gender statistical slash workers compare to general non-slash traditional work statistics, same or worse? And is there any breakdown available as to sectors, for the culture and creative sectors? Thanks. So please, first, Sarah de Horst, quickly.
Yes, I will be very brief. Thank you, Laurent, for this question. It's true that what we've seen, for example, in the pandemic, but also another situation, is that those who have another steady employment besides their freelancing activity are usually covered mainly by that first stable employment. But when we see that not all slashers have a stable employment, especially in certain sectors, like in the arts, for example, but not only, we cannot rely on the fact that the first stable employment is going to be sufficient to cover all the needs. And so we believe that clearly there is a need that every job provides all the security and social protection that the workers need. And I would go even beyond the legal status of salaried contract, standard contract, and saying that every job should be able to pay people decently, which means even if you're self-employment, cover your working hours, to cover the use of the tools that you're using, your phone, your internet, whatever, but also your social protection, be it public or private. And we're not there yet. That's as short as I can be.
Thank you. I would like to kindly ask the translators just for 3-4 minutes more. I know that you have the break, but need to finish. Laurent, very quickly, do you want to have some concluding remarks?
Many thanks, Vassil. I'll be short. Very interesting presentation from Ricardo also. And the point is taken also on the way slash workers may be in situations that are in contradictions with working time regulation. I forgot just to pay justice also to all what announced in the action plan on the social pillar. I forgot to mention that the Commission, DG Employment, will also propose a new strategic framework when it comes to occupation, safety and health at work in the second quarter, so meaning very soon. I did not focus so much on the way we monitor statistics and so forth, may not be so interesting for colleagues listening, and Ricardo was doing it anyway. But just to mention also that with the labor force survey, since this year, we'll now be in a better position to, let's say, measure those economically dependent self-employed, defined as those without employees and who have either only one or one main client, and also whose main client decide the working hours. So this is new, EU-wide, that all member states will measure that on an annual basis through their whole labor force. So let's say it's still important to mention, because we're talking today about slash workers, but the issue of obviously bogus self-employed is very much on the table, as you mentioned already, Vassil, before. I hope I could give you, in the 10 or a bit more minutes I took, a basic overview of what we do when it comes to social protection. It's obviously a very large field of policy. And I just put in the chat where you can find both the council recommendation and the monitoring framework that was endorsed since then. We hope member states will submit ambitious national plans soon, and so don't hesitate to contact me in case you have any questions. And many thanks from Sarah to replying. I mean, it's not often that it's panelists asking questions to others, so sorry for the strange, but it was also my curiosity, what is the smart position on that? So many thanks to all, and happy to follow the rest of the seminar.
Thank you very much, Laurent. Ricardo, very quickly, and thanks, because in your presentation you illustrated all this increasing share of non-standard jobs, gender sensitive, and taking different forms. It's very important. Concluding remarks from your side?
Well, unfortunately, I didn't have time to show some interesting findings with statistics, but the very first conclusion is we need to research more, really particularly on slash workers, because this is something that is not evident, and there are many gaps that you cannot really analyze only based on statistics. So we need to go really to the core. And secondly, of course, as slash work and also platform work and other unconventional work patterns and forms of employment, as I said before, they have some negative and positive aspects. So really, but overall, what data shows is that there are significant shares of slash workers that have a very poor job quality overall, and not only in the second job, but also in the first job. And it means that probably we need to work on it, because in the end, the problem of this is that you are running the risk of accumulating poor job quality in various jobs, which is really a very bad situation. Thank you for.
Thank you, Ricardo. You should be very attentive with this, because we see a lot of them could be in a very precarious situation. And it will be a great contribution from Swirl if Eurofound will take the concept of slash workers and include it in your future research programs. So we'll be very pleased. Pam, concluding remarks.
Good marketing.
So yes, thanks everyone. I'm not going to ask Laurent or Ricardo to say something here, but maybe in another way or place. But one of the things a question that arose to me was, like, who writes the plans that you are getting from Laurent, the national plans, and also for Ricardo, are you capturing really all of the people who are holding multiple jobs? You don't have to answer that now, we can discuss that, because the thing that I wanted to point out was work like ours in Swirl, then we really get to talk to people on the ground. We get to talk to the various kinds of industrial relations actors who are actually on the front lines. And we also get to talk to the slash workers themselves about what actually their working and life situations are. And this is an incredibly important kind of aspect that really needs to be addressed more often. I think that the translators are going on break now, so.
Yeah, so I just had a message from Sarah. Thanks, first of all, I would like to thank everybody for this very lively session. A lot of questions that probably can be addressed also during the second part of the seminar, and translators need to rest a bit. So the second part will start in 15 minutes. So at 11:40. So thanks again.
Thanks to you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, I think we can start our last panel of the day and of the final webinar. I want to thank the discussant, so Professor Anna Sor, Associate Professor at the Employment Relations Research Center and President of the Danish Sociological Association, and many other roles. Maybe you can add them later. And the same for Giuseppe Guerini, spokesperson for the Social Economy Group, and many others. But I'll keep it short in order to go to the content of our panel. So before starting our panel, I ask Sarah to share a video about case studies. So our last panel is about case studies, and we will briefly introduce the panel with a short video.
In the frame of the Swirl project, we've explored the links between slashers, contingent work, and platforms. Through case studies, we also analyzed different organizations across Europe that support these workers, to better understand emerging and relevant practices that organize, protect, and/or represent slashers. Here, we will present two cases that show the diversity of levels of action that can be envisaged. The case of HappyDev, the French network of independent workers active in the digital field, and Consegne Etiche, an initiative of the city of Bologna that brings together different actors to deliver the last mile.
C'est un réseau de collectifs, donc chaque collectif est indépendant, a son fonctionnement propre, mais tous ces petits collectifs sont reliés entre eux et forment un grand réseau. Ce grand réseau va générer beaucoup plus d'opportunités et va faire qu'on va avoir un effet de levier qui va nous permettre d'accéder à des projets plus grands, qui va nous permettre de mieux travailler, de s'entraider, peut-être aussi d'aller négocier des choses avec des partenaires parce qu'on est nombreux, de nous faire entendre. À la différence des plateformes où les indépendants ne sont pas forcément connectés entre eux et où il y a moins de relations humaines qui se tissent. Nous, on est très axé là-dessus, sur le travail entre les indépendants, pour les indépendants. C'est vraiment ce qui fait la différence et du coup, on ne se positionne pas comme des concurrents les uns avec les autres, mais vraiment comme des alliés. Les freelances se repassent des projets entre eux. Il y a aussi des formats de mentoring avec des seniors qui vont accompagner des juniors. Et on se rend compte que plus on est nombreux, par exemple, plus on est de designers, plus on va avoir de demandes en design. En fait, on a un fonctionnement donc, horizontal. Il n'y a aucun salarié au sein du réseau. On a un fonctionnement coopératif. Ensuite, chaque collectif est une société et ils ont le libre choix de leur statut. Certains sont en association, d'autres sont en coopérative, d'autres encore sont des SAS à capital variable. Chaque collectif ne va pas se reverser de dividendes. L'idée, c'est vraiment d'avoir une structure commune qui va nous permettre de facturer et surtout de nous présenter aux clients avec la même entité. Ils vont avoir une facture unique. Et ensuite, le collectif va récupérer 5% de cette facture, mais ce n'est pas vraiment des dividendes, ce n'est pas reversé à des dirigeants puisqu'il n'y a pas de dirigeants. Ces 5% sont réinvestis dans le fonctionnement du collectif local et c'est décidé par les associés.
Arriva la pandemia e l'amministrazione coinvolge la fondazione nel cercare un'alternativa a tutti i cittadini per la condizione di lavoro dei rider, ma anche per quanto riguarda i commercianti che erano obbligati ad usare le piattaforme. Dopo una prima fase di interlocuzione abbiamo creato un manifesto che ci serviva a capire che cosa voleva dire essere alternativi. Per cui siamo andati a identificare i diritti minimi del lavoro, le tutele, la mobilità sostenibile, un uso non competitivo dei dispositivi, soprattutto tra commercianti, e una trasparenza anche verso proprio il territorio. Hanno aderito commercianti, hanno aderito alcuni supermercati, istituzioni, biblioteche e mercati rionali. Per cui cosa è accaduto a Bologna? Chiunque può chiedere di ricevere a casa cibo, fare la spesa, ma anche dei libri appunto dalle istituzioni biblioteche. E questo servizio viene realizzato da delle cooperative che hanno assunto dei fattorini che vengono compensati con un guadagno di 9 euro l'ora, con tutte le tutele. Usano cargo bike, biciclette, quindi azzeramento dell'inquinamento, e senza costi per i commercianti. Questi sono i 3 pilastri del servizio. L'agenda digitale del comune ha creato il sito web. I fattorini sono delle cooperative, sono assunti dalle cooperative e sono le cooperative che creano degli accordi con i commercianti. Quando i commercianti creano degli accordi con le cooperative, garantiscono un minimo di consegne. Questo ci permette di organizzare il lavoro.
Both Sophie and Michele mentioned that for their collective, cooperative, and redistributive initiatives, it is difficult to access classical investments, which expects high return on investment, as their models provide high benefit return to the communities they support. More information on www.swirlproject.eu.
Okay, here we are. I will introduce, wait, I share the screen. No, 1 minute. Okay, here we are. So I will introduce the panel with the main results of our analysis about case studies. I'll try to keep it short in order to leave more time for conversation and discussion later. And but I want to really keep this opportunity to thanks again all the research team, and in particular the Spanish team, because they set the case studies, and my colleagues from the Italian team and Università Cattolica, Cecilia Manzo, Anna Mori, and Davide Arcidiacono. So let's start. The last part of our project was we looked for experience of protection and representation of slash workers and contingent workers in 5 countries of the project. What is important to say immediately is that at the moment, at least, we have not found experiences with the main focus on slash workers, on multiple jobs. The focus is mainly on contingent workers and the platform workers. And the involvement in different multiple activities is considered, but just because it is spread among contingent workers and platform workers. So it's a side topic and not the focus of the intervention in these projects. We carried out 15 case studies, and they were selected based on the experts' opinion. So Vassil and Pamela explained very well the part of the research based on expert interviews, and based on that interviews, we selected the case studies. So only in retrospective, we look for elements in common between the cases, and we group them in this way. You can see there. We distinguish between more voice-oriented and representation-oriented actions, and entrepreneurial cases aim at building alternative economic models. So, the other pole. And we differentiated between more institutionalized and less institutionalized cases. Of course, the same cases could be analyzed in different ways. For example, the degree of digitalization could be a different way to analyze the same cases. But today we don't have time to consider this variable as well, so we stay on this model. So the first quadrant concerns more institutionalized voice actions, those promoted by trade unions. Here you can see our case studies. So we have IG Metall fair crowd work. It's a code of conduct for crowd working platforms, and they set a mediation forum to resolve conflicts between the platform that signed the code of conducts and their workers. And we have CITAB, I don't know the pronunciation, so sorry if I mispronunciated, CITAB app from Bulgaria. And it's an app where workers can report through the app workplace irregularities and in particular for people without contracts. And to Resposta Sindacal, we saw the video this morning in the previous panel in Spain. It's an internet-based trade union section to meet the demands for platform workers. So these initiatives have some features in common. The main object here is labor rights violations. These are initiatives aimed at expanding the reference basin of traditional trade unions, using digital channel to communicate with workers, and also addressing platform workers who are, as we know, still underrepresented. For this reason, they are open to non-members, mainly open to non-members. And so non-members can use this kind of app or services. And the results are promising, as you can see. So they're still at the first stage, but they are good. So IG Metall, 50 conflicts submitted through the mediation forum. The app had 100,000 downloads, so a lot of downloads, a lot of interest. And to Resposta Sindacal, nearly 2,000 inquiries through the web page. And they also established a union section in Glovo and Deliveroo, and they are expanding their activities to other platforms. Weaknesses. There are some technical impediments, in particular for the app. So we had for the app 100,000 downloads, but then only 100 notifications, due in part to some technical issue. So there is something to be improved there. Some limitation also for IG Metall because of the platform that signed the code of conduct are only 10 platforms. So it's difficult to involve other platforms and to spread the initiative out of Germany. And to Resposta Sindacal, they try to use the website also to do some research, to know better about working condition of this kind of worker, but participation in these particular activity was low. So it was good in order to collect inquiries, but less good for research activity. Second quadrant, it's again about voice, but it's more bottom-up activities. So it's less institutionalized. It's about collectives of workers. These initiatives are mainly about platform workers and in particular riders, but we have also, so you can see Riders for the Ratios and a platform in Germany, a Facebook group that became later a subunit of a union in Germany. But we have also a collective in France that it's not about platform worker, is about sound artisans. Digitalization is still a topic here and it's important, but in a different kind of jobs. Main problems here are precarious jobs, lack of social protection, and the lack of representation and participation. Promoters are workers active in the industries involved. Sometimes students are also involved, in particular for riders movements, because they are not afraid of losing their job. So they are activists that promote the initiatives, and then workers are involved. Membership is open. You can see here the results they obtain. And so they are really obtaining some important results. So they are very interesting form of self-organization. Difficulties here are related mainly to the involvement of workers who may lose their jobs due to their activism. And it's quite difficult when they want, they not always want it, but when they want to move from an informal movement to a trade union, it's not easy here to go to more structured forms. Okay, I move to the third quadrant. So it's about business ventures initiatives. So the idea here is to create new entrepreneurial activities that are more ethical, more fair for workers, and so on, and more cooperatives. The less structured quadrant is concerned for new form of matching. So we have a Facebook group in Bulgaria that match demand and supply of freelance, and an interesting initiative in Italy to match demand and supply of workers and work in the agricultural sector, a very interesting sector for slash workers. Here, the problem is about power asymmetries and opacity. The promoters are not workers, but they are social entrepreneurs. So they are people out of the sector, mainly out of the sector, but they can see an opportunity to build an ethical business, and they move in this direction. So the idea here is to improve the quality of matching and to promote collaboration between workers and increase transparency. So the idea is to do better what other companies are doing in a way that they do not consider good for workers. Last quadrant, the one with more case studies, and I think that's interesting to see that we have a lot of case studies here. We have Doc Servizi in Italy, a self-management cooperative enterprise for artists and technicians in the music industry, and Smart, of course, Smart Belgium, but our case studies were in Spain and Germany in order to analyze the differences between countries. So the same model in different socioeconomic systems, and it's really interesting to see how the same model being implemented in different countries. Happy Dev, the one we just watched in the video, so it's an umbrella brand for various cooperatives in France for the IT sector. CopCycle in France and Consegne Etiche, the one in the video, in Italy. Both of them are about delivery, food delivery, and not only delivery in general. And for Airbnb, a platform that promotes an alternative, the name tells it easily, an alternative to Airbnb, the accommodation platform. So these are our case studies. And I think that part of our discussion will be about this kind of initiatives. The problems they try to address, it's mainly about intermittent job and multiple commitment. This is the quadrant where the problem for multiple activities are more at the center of their attention and initiatives. So here is where the founder of the cooperatives put the slash problems at the center of, more than in other cases, at the center of their attention and initiatives. Promoters are workers in the industries involved. Membership is by sector, but without formal restriction, even because, of course, people perform more jobs. Results. They are obtaining, what they are obtaining is to maintain the flexibility and autonomy of workers, but at the same time ensuring the protection of workers. And what is interesting here is that they introduce collective logic in sectors based on highly individualized forms of work. Weaknesses, maybe we can see them better in the last slide, that's here. So, as always happens with the classifications, more than the positioning of each case study in the quadrants, what is really interesting, I think, here are the movement between quadrants. So the dynamics between one quadrant and the other. I think that all of us, we are aware of the tension between movement and institutions, and between bottom-up and top-down initiatives. What's new here, I think, is the relationship, or at least not new but changing, is the relationship that emerges between voice actions and alternative entrepreneurship actions. What we have been seeing in recent years is a fall of the boundaries between those traditionally more distinct forms of collective action. In particular, cooperatives play an increasingly important role in representing workers' needs. This role can lead to new alliances with trade union, for example, but also have, as we have seen in many cases, some what we can call it jurisdictional conflicts. In this transition phase, the expert we consulted view some characteristics of this experience as, at the same time, strengths and weaknesses. So, for example, they can function as pedagogical tools to change neoliberal mentalities, to show that some alternatives are possible, but at the same time, they can be considered palliative measures, so stopgaps. that do not move from an affirmative process to a really transformative one. So the same point was raised by experts saying it's a risk and it's an opportunity at the same time, seeing it as a weakness or a strength. Furthermore, some of these experiences depend, in particular the cooperatives one, depend strongly on critical customers, willing to pay a higher price to ensure that workers' rights are respected. The new, in particular for the platform companies, the new digital monopolies, unlike the traditional ones, retain the benefit for our customers, mainly at the expenses of worker rights. The alliance between customers and workers is fragile. It's more and more fragile. And perhaps it's not our topic here, but maybe we should also analyze the impact of the shift of critical consumers from job protection and labor rights to environmental protection. Because we know that they are different forms of sustainability and they are complementary to each other, but sometimes we can see there is a shift of attention and it can change the focus on labor rights. So the analysis of these cases stimulates many other reflection and analysis, but I stop here for the moment to collect comments from our discussant. So I stop the screen, wait, here, okay, here. And I leave the floor to Anna. Do you want to start?
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you for inviting me to this exciting project and workshop here. Hello, everyone from sunny Copenhagen, where we are kind of optimistic today on everything. I think this is a really important project. You're really addressing some of the hurdles and the challenge of getting these slash workers, slash practices on board. I think we all share, it's a very difficult research field, but a very important one. I think I want to focus on your typology, the 4 types you have developed from all these case studies, and I want to perhaps tease out some of the strengths and weaknesses that you point to, perhaps add some comments to that, some further strengths and weaknesses, because I think it's a very interesting typology and something you can work further on also for academic publication and so on. And then I want to have a final remark on perhaps some of the issues that we are not focusing so much on currently in this field of research, but perhaps we should focus more on. So first, your typology. I think it's really straightforward to look at trade union initiatives, and you look a lot on grievances, conflict resolution. I was a bit surprised you didn't include collective agreements here as an important trade union initiatives, because we have some significant examples already, both in platform work, but also in relation to some groups of freelancers. And I think that's also at the EU level a very hot potato at the moment. So I was a bit surprised about that. So perhaps you could even expand this category. Of course, for everybody, we would see who have studied industrial relations, non-standard work and so on, we would say, well, this is the strong category, right? Here, workers will have most power. For a researcher like me, who have studied the platform economy in the Nordics the last 5 years, I would say it's not just a strong category. It's a strong category on some aspects, but perhaps weaker on other aspects. I think you are right that this typology, that's the kind of collectivism in this where you have most bargaining power and you have most power for solving grievances and so on. But I think a major weakness here is that in many of these initiatives, we can also see it in your cases, but also I've studied a lot of collective agreements for platform workers in the Nordics. And major weakness is that even where we have such initiatives, unions almost do not organize any of the workers covered. They're not members of these organizations. So I think we have perhaps a case of bargaining power, but with low representation. They have very little dialogue, communication with these workers for natural reasons. They try to, of course, improve that by doing workshops, focus groups, and so on. But I see there's a barrier here, and I think that there's a challenge here that we will see some of these initiatives, some of these agreements, some of these way of conflict resolution and complaint channels, ombudsman, and so on. The question is, what will the power be of all that in the long run? And what will the take-up rate be if unions do not organize these workers? I think that's a major concern. The second category that you tease out, which I also think is really, really important, are the new worker collectives. We see them both physically, online, and so on. I think the strong aspect of this one is representation. I think that's really, and I think that's why you talk about alliances between these forms, or maybe transitions, movement between the forms. And I think that's really true, because what they can do here is that they actually have some voice from these workers. They know what they want, do not want. Maybe not in a structured or systematic way, but there's much more representation, you can say, potentially. So alliances between type 1 and 2 might be of interest here, because they do not have much bargaining power if they don't join up with the unions. So I think that's one of the weaknesses of this form. Then there's the third form, the matching form. I think that's in your framework here, maybe the most weakly defined form. It's a bit difficult for me to tease out what you mean, also because to my experience, some of the other examples here are freelancer bureaus, some of these issues, and it's a category where you have high end and low end. And I think you really need to tease out the skill element here, whether you want to, I mean, are you studying the whole group, or maybe you want to focus on one of them? Obviously, I mean, all these institutional elements like bargaining power and representation are weaker here, but maybe other potentials could come from this category. However, I'm a bit unsure whether these potentials are different, whether we study the unskilled matching platforms or bureaus, or the high-skilled. I think there are, for instance, in Denmark, we have a high-skilled matching platform where you have like €1,000 per hour payment, and you have some in the low end where you have less than €10 per hour. So it's a very diverse field. So I would like to know more about how you envision this. Then there's the fourth category on the cooperatives, and I think that's also a very prevalent category, and you see that in other studies. I think it's really relevant. You mentioned the potentials of representation here, which I think also are interesting, especially in alliances with some of the other forms. However, I might add another potential to that. I think also from your videos, maybe there's a potential here to scale up the volume of work. I think that's the main challenge for slash workers, contingent workers, platform workers, is to reach a full-time employment. There's so much underemployment. Even if you combine 2 or 3 more forms of employment, you still see underemployment. So how can we scale up volume? Maybe there's a potential here in the cooperatives that you can have more full-time workers, and also maybe have more workers that operate within single sectors, because I think that's another under-investigated challenge of these slash workers, is that they operate in several sectors. And that's why they are very difficult for traditional unions to organize and represent. So how can we scale up the volume of work? Maybe there's a potential here. And turning to my final remark, I would say I really enjoyed your typology. I think it's really inspiring, and I think you can publish a lot on this, also with all your cases. Perhaps you have some potential here unused that you can maybe further develop, because the usual points we study in all this is, of course, bargaining power and representation and so on when we study collectivism in non-standard work. But perhaps we should add to that a more fundamental challenge is the lack of full-time work and the types of work where you cross several sectors. Maybe there will be forms of collectivism in the future, that strong forms of collectivism that can handle that you operate in several sectors. But at the moment, traditional unions are not very fit to address that. So to me, that's, I think, maybe a further potential of your study that you could also emphasize, perhaps in this cooperative category, perhaps in some of the categories I haven't spotted, but it's not just about bargaining power and representation, it's also about underemployment and perhaps simplifying employment so it's not so complex. Yeah, I think I will stop here. Thank you for inviting me, and I look forward to hear your remarks.
Thank you very much. I think I will leave the floor to Giuseppe Guerrini, and then we can discuss it. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Professor Pais. Thank you to SMART for all organizations that participate at this very interesting webinar. I switch to French for my intervention. Je ne parle pas très bien français, mais je préfère le français. Très bien. Donc, encore merci. C'est une grande affinité avec nombreux points avec la présentation que vous avez fait et l'enquête que nous avons menée l'année dernière en tant que SECOP sur les travailleurs atypiques et indépendants. Ce qui émerge, c'est une image de transformation du travail très profonde à laquelle nous devons consacrer beaucoup d'attention. Donc, merci pour ça. Et merci même en tant que membre du Comité économique et social européen, parce qu'on est en train de démarrer une avis d'initiative sur le sujet emploi atypique et plateformes coopératives dans le cadre de la transformation numérique des entreprises. Donc, cet webinaire et votre travail de recherche, c'est très intéressant et très important pour nous. Et nous aurons donc l'occasion de parler dans les prochains mois et je serai très heureux de pouvoir partager avec vous ce travail que nous allons faire à partir du mois de juillet. Donc, j'ai trouvé les définitions des 4 modèles d'analyse du travail très intéressants entre les collectifs organisés, les initiatives syndicales, les modèles de gouvernance et les nouvelles formes de rencontres pour l'offre et la demande de travail qui deviennent faire face à plus ou moins d'institutionnalisation et à la tension entre concurrence et droit, qui semble parfois nous faire remonter à l'époque de la 2e révolution industrielle, précisément à l'époque où naissent les mouvements collectifs de travailleurs, d'où naîtront les syndicats modernes, mais aussi les mutuelles, les coopératives surgiront également de ce même contexte où il y a un rôle décisif des nouvelles technologies. Autant d'antan, c'est l'industrialisation, aujourd'hui c'est le numérique. Donc, si la transformation industrielle de la production de masse et du travail, donc sont les premières restaurants des coopératives, mais aussi les premières du syndicalisme, qui sont également accompagnées d'une vision, je peux dire, pédagogique, qui nous rappelle que nous ne pouvons pas faire de grands changements, de la promotion des droits, de la transformation sociale, de la protection sociale, si nous n'avons pas aussi une vision culturelle, éducative et formatrice des travailleurs. Donc, je réfère par exemple à Frédéric Raiffeisen ou Robert Owen. Ce sont des chercheurs, comment on peut dire, des maîtres à penser qui ont essayé de construire une vision et une vocation pour un modèle de développement qui rémunérait l'attention sur la centralité de la personne où le travail des masses dans les grandes usines a conduit à la dépersonnalisation. Aujourd'hui, comme ailleurs, nous nous trouvons dans un contexte de forte transformation, avec une très forte accélération de l'économie qui, avec le numérique, la digitalisation, permettent des énormes concentrations de richesses et de pouvoir à une vitesse incroyable, qui entraîne des changements tout aussi rapides dans l'organisation du travail avec des nouvelles formes d'exploitation. Mais maintenant, le contexte est très différent. Le travail est brisé, est pulvérisé et les travailleurs sont fragmentés, découpés en ce que nous pouvons définir une individualisation de masse, des slice workers, comme on a entendu dire ce matin. Si l'usine à la chaîne de montage était la représentation exemplaire de l'industrialisation de l'économie, les plateformes sont la nouvelle organisation du travail à l'ère de l'économie numérique. Mais là où l'usine a ajouté et concentré les travailleurs, la numérisation permet aujourd'hui la division du travail et même des travailleurs avec ces formes d'individualisation massive qui, pour les consommateurs, représentent la possibilité d'élargir énormément les possibilités des choix. Mais pour les travailleurs, cela signifie traiter avec une pluralité d'employeurs potentiels. Paradoxalement, autant qu'il y a d'appareils numériques à partir desquels démarrer une commande. Donc, autant de patrons aussi que de smartphones avec une commande. Donc, cette individualisation se transforme en solitude, incertitude, exposition au risque. Dans les deux cas, elle s'accompagne d'échanges de pouvoirs, de contrôle et de participation. Donc, cette fragmentation peut prendre la forme d'une nouvelle aliénation composée d'exploitation et de dépersonnalisation. Au contraire, si nous pouvons nous organiser comme nous le montrent certaines histoires analysées dans la recherche et que nous vient d'entendre, par exemple, dans les vidéos d'introduction, cela peut prendre la forme d'une nouvelle leadership, de la prise en charge du rôle proactif des travailleurs qui peut être exercé et doit prendre la forme d'une nouvelle esprit d'entreprise, d'une nouvelle propension à entreprendre, qui nous permettent de jouer le rôle des indépendants à la fois et celui d'un groupe organisé qui transforme la solidarité ou la relation mutuelle en énergie entrepreneuriale. Donc, la mondialisation et l'évolution technologique ont changé le monde du travail, conduisant à dépasser une vision de l'emploi composée principalement de travail dépendant. L'entrepreneuriat et l'auto-entrepreneuriat sont aujourd'hui les leviers fondamentaux de la croissance. En ce sens, la transition numérique ouvre des perspectives très intéressantes pour une autre idéal de travail et d'entreprise. Aujourd'hui, de nouvelles formes de coopératives émergent, parmi lesquelles Smart, aussi les témoignages qu'on a entendus ce matin. Ça peut être que dans les prochaines décennies, on parlera des pionnières de Smart, aussi comme aujourd'hui, dans le mouvement coopératif, on parle de pionnières de Rochdale. Mais il s'agit de nouvelles formes de coopératives qui peuvent représenter un excellent outil pour promouvoir une plus grande diffusion des compétences entrepreneuriales et un soutien des jeunes dans les défis d'entreprise pour de nouvelles activités. En particulier, l'utilisation des nouvelles technologies sur la fond de l'économie de plateforme pourrait trouver dans l'utile coopératif un moyen de faire une sorte que de nombreux travailleurs soient également propriétaires de ces plateformes. Avec le numérique et l'infrastructure des plateformes, l'échange mutuel ne concerne pas seulement le travail, mais peut être attendu pour expérimenter concret utile pour organiser une nouvelle forme de relation entre producteurs et consommateurs. Dans la mutualité, qui ne repose pas sur l'opportunisme, mais sur la solidarité. Il ne s'agit pas donc d'une sharing economy modèle Silicon Valley, mais de vraie économie de partage, modèle social et mutuel. C'est pourquoi que je suis convaincu que les coopératives doivent s'organiser pour acquérir des compétences et des capacités en exploitant le potentiel des technologies numériques qui sont la grande qualité de qui se prêtent très bien à la répartition horizontale des pouvoirs pour faire partir une collective pour permettre une accessibilité généralisée, décentralisée et transparente à l'activité économique d'entreprise, au travail. Désormais, pour faire face à ces défis, les coopératives doivent assumer la responsabilité de former et informer au maximum les nombreux travailleurs qui sont dans ces mouvements. Il faut savoir qu'il ne s'agit pas d'informatiser le travail, mais de transformer radicalement la culture et l'organisation du travail pour assumer une forme de pensée numérique. Aujourd'hui, nous vivons dans une situation d'un momentum très favorisé pour ça. On est dans une infosphère qui est composée à la fois de contenus physiques et biologiques, ainsi que les contenus numériques, virtuels, informatiques qui changent notre façon de vivre, de penser. Donc, pour ça, je pense que c'est important que les coopératives se préparent même à gérer l'énergie principale de ça, c'est-à-dire les données. Si le vapeur était l'énergie de l'industrialisation, l'électricité, c'est l'énergie de la mondialisation, les données seront le carburant de la transition numérique. Donc, pour les coopératives, posséder, traiter, échanger des données devient stratégique. Donc, il faut que les coopératives ajoutent les données à l'échange mutuel pour continuer à jouer un rôle dans la démocratisation du travail. Donc, c'est ça le grand défi qu'on doit affronter en tant que coopérative, mais aussi, je pense, toute l'Europe doit penser à le rôle de l'économie sociale pour soutenir une forme nouvelle de travail plus soutenable et plus équitable pour réduire les inégalités. Merci beaucoup pour votre attention et merci pour la recherche vraiment très intéressante. Merci beaucoup encore.
Thank you both. Quick comments so we can then open the discussion. Collective agreements, it's about the division of labor in the research process. It was in a different work package. So it is there. It's part of our research, but it was in the previous, in a different work package, but I completely agree. And we should find a way now to recombine our results and think to them in a different way. So not how we produced our research data, but how we analyze them. And so it's an important part of our analysis, and I completely agree. And thanks, Anna, I really thank you for all your inputs. There is a lot here. I think we do not have enough time. Just to react quickly, alliances between 1 and 2, they are already there. For example, in our cases, the Spanish cases show it really well. So there is something there. I completely agree with your point, and I think that in particular the lack of full-time work is something we should work, because what's interesting from different WP, work package, not this one, was that in our interviews, but also the data tell us that people having multiple jobs in multiple sectors, they still want more jobs. They still want more working hours. They still need it. And I think that it goes strict, it's important here, and also about the idea of having multiple activities in different sectors is something that affects trade union initiative. At the same time, at least I know better about Italy, but I can see it also in other countries, when trade unions try to set part of their organization devoted to alternative workers, and not by sector, but by contracts, still they are not the strong part of the trade union. They usually are from an organizational point of view, they are there, and it's important to have there, but they do not have power. And that's something that affects the way they can operate, and the way to represent workers. So they are a sort of B-series workers and B-series trade unions. And so they are not at the core of the initiative of the trade unions. And after some years, we can see the effects of this peripheral strategy. And thank you, Giuseppe, for all of your input, in particular about the relationship between customers and workers, and your inputs about data. I think that's really, really important. What I can see now in the debate is that the focus is mainly, when we speak about data, the focus is mainly about the redistribution of value to the producer. So the idea is that data create value, we should redistribute that. I think what is more important now is to think about how to use data, not how to redistribute the value. Because also if we can redistribute the value, it's not such a value at individual level that can really affect the way we act. It's more important to open a discussion about collectively decide how to use data, and people and organizations that can use data. So I think that the cooperatives can do a lot in this field in the next month and in the next year. And it's something that it's important to discuss and to think about. It's the new challenge, not only for cooperative, but you can play an important role here. And also trade unions, but they cannot see you. I do not see a debate inside trade union about data, as trade union as a collective that can manage the way, for example, workers could use data in a collective way. I do not see a debate into trade union. Maybe I am not aware of it, but I'm not. While in the cooperative sector, it's the beginning, but it's something that's already there. So thank you both. I think that we can now open the floor and ask for questions, comments, and please feel free to, we have half an hour together, so if you have any question related even to other part of the project, I think that we can use this last part of our webinar for an open debate, and so you can use the chat, you can, I think that you can raise your hands and speak as you prefer. Let's see if we have any question. To wait some seconds to. Otherwise, we can continue. Okay, Sarah.
Since many people are shy, I'll go for it. And thank you for this very interesting panel and for the input of all the speakers. I have especially a question on the working time, because it's something that we haven't really dealt with, except saying that the slashers in the research, slashers are working way more hours than average. On the one hand, I'm just going to challenge this, because I know that many workers who like their jobs, like many, not all slashers, are very passionate about their jobs. We have a lot of these cases within the researchers, for example, work many more hours than they are supposed to be working. So on contract, they are working, I don't know, 40 hours or following the countries there. But actually, we know that they're actually working a lot more. And it's, so on the one hand. On the other hand, we see that in the slashers world and the freelancing world, there are some people who are working way too much or not enough. But there is a difficult balance in the working hours. Shouldn't this also in the light of the industrial revolutions that Giuseppe was talking about, and given the links also with the high productivity of workers that has increased over the last decades, and the fact that there's a big number of unemployment, shouldn't this discussion also rethink the average working time, in the sense that if we continue to have, and I know some unions are working for that, or claiming that. The thing is, if there's so much unemployment, if there's some people who are working way too much, shouldn't we change, and the productivity has grown so much, shouldn't we change the average working time necessary to live, which would affect in the end also the slashers and the self-employed, because it means we have different standards. It also means that we have to rethink, of course, the cost of labor. But I think maybe, I don't know if one of you wants to tackle this aspect. And of course, I think that the data is a whole new chapter we really have to look into.
I don't know, maybe if Anna, do you want, you raised the point about, yeah.
Yeah, so I've studied the issue of working time for many years, even before I entered the study of non-standard work and platform work. And working time flexibility, it has many aspects. And I think as is raised here, you have part of contingent workers working many more hours than they should, and you have some that work less hours. I think I would raise 2 points with regards to that. One is skill level. I know that especially some of the freelancer platforms where they have very high skilled people, they work a lot more hours than the normal working hours, whereas in the low skilled end, we have a more vulnerable group with underemployment. Then there's a second aspect, and that's full-time is not just about the weekly working hours, it's also about predictability of hours. So if workers are very unsure whether they will have enough of work, they can have an insurance strategy where they kind of work more hours or have more jobs. There are multiple job holders with many more jobs than perhaps needed, but just as an insurance strategy. And then they are kind of overworked just to be sure to have enough hours. And together with colleagues, I've worked formulating the concept of living hours, which is kind of something that addresses that, you know, earning enough, it's not just about living wages, but it's actually also about accruing enough hours. So it doesn't help if you have, you know, a high wage per hour if you have very few hours. So living hours is an important aspect. Do you have enough hours? And part of this is not just the number of weekly hours, it's not also about the predictability of hours. So yeah, I think that's the two aspects, the skill level and also the predictability of hours are important here.
Thank you. We have a question from Maria Concetta Ambra. Hi, ciao Maria Concetta. How many workers fall into each type in Italy? Do riders fall into more than one quadrant? Our typology and classification was built based on initiatives and not on workers. And it was done, as I said, after we collected the experiences. So I think that I can answer to your question, and both Anna comments about the weakness of the third quadrant. It is in part because of the classification was built after, so it was not a way to collect case studies, but it was a way to analyze them after having done the case studies. And so looking more into that quadrant, maybe we can find other case studies that allow us to implement it and have a clear idea of what's inside that. And workers, we cannot really say how many workers are in each of them, because it's more about the initiative than the workers involved. We could estimate that, yeah, that riders can be into more than one quadrant. For example, in Italy, but not only in Italy, there are a lot of bottom-up movement and at the same time cooperatives for riders. So we have both of them. My point here, and always, is that I have some opinion about that, but the fact that all of the initiatives are about riders is something that I cannot really completely explain, because, for example, at least in Italy, we know that people performing domestic cleaning through platforms, so through platforms like Helpling or so on, the number is higher than riders. And no one speaks about them in the public debate, and also from a representation point of view and bottom-up movement, and everything is about riders nowadays. And I think that I know why, and but at the same time, as a researcher, yeah, there is a gender issue and a visibility issue, because riders are in our streets. And I think that there are plenty of reasons that can explain why the riders are the center of our attention. At the same time, I think that as researchers, at least, I don't speak for trade unionists or others, but as researchers, we should look more into other kind of digital workers and workers, not protected workers, and yeah, still continue to care about riders, but use all the knowledge we have nowadays about riders to try to build something new for different kind of digital workers and riders. And I have a question. Yeah, please, Anne.
It was just a comment on why are riders organizing and domestic cleaners via platforms not organizing. I think on top of the visibility and all those issues, it's also physical space is very important for organizing, and at least what we see here in Copenhagen, the studies I participate in, is that riders meet physically and they talk when they wait for the food and so on. So there's a natural social interaction among riders. So if you clean in private households, you don't meet each other. Maybe you take each other's shifts, but it's not a social thing in the same time. So physical space matters for social interaction and for organizing.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that's a policy measure, opening space.
Moi aussi, j'ai un commentaire avec ces questions-là. Oui, ce qu'on peut observer, c'est la transformation très en profondeur même des lieux de travail. Si on pense, par exemple, au télétravail, on a transformé notre maison en bureau. On a les coins de rue qui sont des lieux de travail ou d'attente du travail, comme vous avez dit pour les riders. Mais c'est changé beaucoup le lieu où le travail se réalise. Et je pense que la coopérative et la technologie, les deux ensemble, peut être inutile, très intéressant pour sortir de la solitude où beaucoup de travailleurs sont concernés. Comme vous l'avez dit, c'est très important la visibilité. Oui, c'est vrai, les riders, on les voit parce qu'ils arrivent dans notre maison, ils arrivent, on les voit dans la rue. Mais il y a, par exemple, beaucoup de travailleurs sur les plateformes qui sont les travailleurs du back-office, par exemple. Celui qui font la modération, comme on dit, des contenus sur les plateformes, sur les social networks. C'est un travail très, très intéressant, très important. Et c'est un travail que la grande part des personnes fait dans son maison. Et donc, il faut réfléchir sur les changements qui vont être en cours dans le lieu du travail et pas seulement dans les formes du travail. Et donc, cela, c'est un défi très intéressant pour tout et concerne même le temps de travail. Parce qu'on n'a plus, comme dans les années arrière, une distinction très précise. Comme vous le savez, c'est un slogan utilisé par le syndicat au début du travail du syndicat. 8 heures pour le travail, 8 heures pour le repos et 8 heures pour la socialisation, la vie. Non. Aujourd'hui, c'est impossible d'avoir sa répartition précise. Donc, on travaille le dimanche, on travaille le samedi, on travaille le lundi, la nuit. Donc, on a le travail qui est, comme dit, arrivé dans tous les réseaux et tout le temps de notre vie. Et ça doit être accompagné d'une vision, même d'une formation. Il faut préparer les personnes. Comme a dit dans son intervention, Sarah, il y a beaucoup de personnes qui aiment beaucoup le travail. Ils sont heureux de travailler 14 heures par journée. Mais ça, oui, moi aussi, je suis peu auprès de ça parce que j'aime beaucoup mon travail, j'aime beaucoup mais ce n'est pas tout à fait une bonne chose, ça, parce qu'il faut avoir du temps pour la famille, il faut avoir du temps pour le loisir, il faut avoir du temps pour étudier. Et je pense que c'est très important, ça. Et je retourne encore une fois à la fin du XVIIe siècle, quand Robert Owen ou Raiffeisen, mais aussi beaucoup d'autres membres qui sont des maîtres à penser du coopérativisme, qui ont réfléchi toujours sur la nécessité de faire des activités d'éducation. Il faut accompagner les personnes dans les transitions qui sont en cours. Et à propos, encore sur les données, on a beaucoup de débats, juste pour ajouter, dans le Comité économique et social européen, il y a même les représentants du syndicat et on discute, on a travaillé beaucoup sur la question des données. Je pense que c'est très important qu'on travaille sur grandir la conscience et le savoir autour des données, parce que les organisations syndicales ont beaucoup de données. Les coopératives ont beaucoup de données sur leur travail. Mais encore, on ne l'utilise pas pour faire ça d'une forme d'organisation. Et je peux dire que la Commission européenne a proposé un nouveau règlement sur la gouvernance des données. Il a proposé l'utilisation des coopératives des données pour faire ça. Mais ce qui va proposer la Commission, c'est un risque pour moi, c'est d'avoir des nouvelles coopératives pour gérer les données, juste les données. Moi, je crois au contraire que c'est important que toutes les organisations de la société civile, les syndicats, les ONG, les associations des bénévoles, les associations des citoyens et aussi les coopératives qui ont des données qui sont utilisées pour le travail, pour leur activité institutionnelle, sont utilisées même pour faire un autre travail, c'est-à-dire redécouvrir une souveraineté digitale, une souveraineté numérique qui, en Europe, on risque de perdre au avantage de la Chine ou des États-Unis d'Amérique. On a beaucoup de notre données qui sont déposées dans le serveur de la Silicon Valley ou dans le serveur de la Chine. Il faut travailler en Europe pour reconquister. Aussi, comme on va parler de la souveraineté des travailleurs, il faut parler de la souveraineté des citoyens sur les données. Ensemble, gendre le numérique et la transformation du travail ou de l'économie pour la démocratie, parce que c'est au cœur de la démocratie économique de demain. Merci.
Thank you. We received a couple of questions. I received one question from a private channel, so I will read it. And I think it's more for Giuseppe. And the question is if there is a conflict between the cooperatives being both employer and representatives of workers' need. And I think I will read also the other questions, so we have both of them. In this complex, Carmen asks, in this complex context, what do you think about the impact of teleworking? So Giuseppe, you was already mentioning it. Do you think we have an important challenge here? So I don't know, maybe we can use these two inputs and have a final comments from both Giuseppe and Anna.
Moi, je peux dire, oui, pour certaines questions, il y a, ça peut être un conflit, mais je peux parler plutôt d'une défi pour gérer au même temps le statut de travailleur et le statut d'entrepreneur. Ça, c'est un grand potentiel pour les coopératives, mais en même temps, c'est un grand risque parce que ce qui s'est passé plusieurs fois en Italie surtout, parce que je connais très bien la situation en Italie, c'est la transformation des coopératives, au contraire d'être une sorte d'utile pour donner aux travailleurs plus de pouvoir, on a transformé les coopératives en une forme nouvelle d'exploitation. On a dit aux travailleurs, aux membres associés des coopératives, tu es un entrepreneur et donc tu dois travailler et renoncer à ton droit. Ça a fait grandir des fonds de coopératives que j'appelle fausses coopératives. Parce que c'est une distorsion de la fonction de la coopérative. C'est le grand risque qu'on peut courir, mais aujourd'hui, je pense qu'avec la technologie et surtout avec la responsabilité des coopératives de faire de la formation pour donner du pouvoir aux membres associés et pas pour utiliser le besoin de travailleurs. Et ça, on va avoir dans certains réseaux des coopératives, surtout sur ce que le secteur du transport, de la livraison de services, et il y a beaucoup d'exploitation. Il y a beaucoup de travailleuses qui sont faibles, qui acceptent de travailler avec moins de droits et plus de travail. Mais ça, c'est un grand risque pour les coopératives. Donc, ça, c'est un conflit. Et je pense qu'on a besoin d'avoir une nouvelle alliance entre coopératives et syndicats des travailleurs. Parce que même les syndicats ont, comme dit, perdu l'attention qu'on a eue dans les années arrière sur les coopératives. Je pense que beaucoup de syndicalistes ont renoncé à croire dans le pouvoir des coopératives, et c'est en même temps une responsabilité des coopératives, mais je pense que c'est nécessaire aujourd'hui de renforcer une nouvelle alliance entre coopératives et mouvement syndical. Merci.
Thank you. Anna, do you want to add some final comments and remarks?
Yes. I think that this issue about employer status and cooperatives is a really important discussion. It's in a gray zone that we see in many parts of contingent work. We see it on the platforms. We see it in the new, you call them matching collectivisms, but we also see it in freelancer bureaus, freelancer companies, all sorts of organizing where you have a kind of independence as worker, but you're also a collective. And I think there's a juridical part of that discussion, but there's, I think, also a size issue. I think that many cooperatives, they have this honeymoon phase where it's relatively small, where it's possible also to work on consensus and so on. But as you grow into size and you need to have established formal forms of representation, you're confronted with some of the same issues that you have also in the union movement with, you know, majority concerns over minority concerns and so on. You have some core workers maybe full-time, you have some peripheral workers, few hours, and you all have all these discussions and differences you want to handle. And so it's one, I think, especially juridical question on employer status, and we have various examples of both the problem but also how to handle it. But I also think that in time, with the size of the cooperative is growing, we have some of the same representation challenges that you also see in traditional unions. And I agree very much with Giuseppe on the alliances with the unions here. I think it's really, really important, but I also think it's important to, even though you have the best intentions, be very conscious on that there will be a honeymoon phase, and then you need to also address some of the diversity in the cooperative, and unions can help you with some of that, but some of it is also problems that extends that alliance. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Anna and Giuseppe, and thank you very much to everyone for these 2 mornings of rich debate. I think that we are concluding our project with a lot of new, important and relevant questions, and that's the best way to conclude the project with new research idea, new project, new and new inputs. And I think it's really good. I want really to thanks again everyone, the team researcher, the interviewees. I think we should thanks more and more our interviewees who provide time and information for us. And a special thanks to Sarah and Sarah from Smart, Sarah with the H and Sarah without the H from Smart, who brilliantly organized these two digital webinars. So thank you very much. Thank you to Nico and his voice. It was an important part of our webinar. So thank you, Nico, and thanks to all the interpreters. You did a great job. So thank you very much. And hope to see in presence somewhere sometimes. I don't know when, but it would be great. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you. Thank you very much. Very interesting. Bye. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Wow.
Grazie. Grazie Sara, grazie Ivana.
Ciao, a presto.
Ciao.
Ciao.
Grazie.